Well, it depends on where you are in the continent, because if you are in France celebrating Bastille Day, you're getting ready for battle. You are getting ready to ramp up your defense spending. You are getting ready to use what the Europeans like to call an anti-coercion tool, basically getting Brussels ready to put retaliatory measures if that 30% is indeed imposed by Donald Trump. But that is a very French dynamic. It's something that Emmanuel Macron talked about over the weekend. He, in fact, is not only talking about going ahead, using this tool, preparing for retaliatory measures. He's talking about ramping up a defense budget that is far earlier, 2 or 3 years earlier than expected. That's what's really shaking this bond market, at least in the last 24 hours. And going into tomorrow, where in French Parliament, a lot of people are going to say, you want to raise this money for defense? Where's the money going to come from? It's going to take us right back to the summer of 2024.
Kriti, in London, how are people thinking about the whole tariff regime coming out of the U.S. here? What's the feeling on the ground there?
Well, in London, this is an I told you so moment, because we're talking about 10%, and there isn't actually that much more pain left for the Brits. And this is where a lot of folks are saying, this was the plus side of Brexit. This is the plus side of not being roped into the European Union, a luxury that, say, the likes of Denmark, Sweden, Norway, that don't actively use the euro, are still struggling with, because they are now subject to 30% as well.
So is the feeling in the European continent that there are still deals to be made with the Trump administration, or is this or we're going to fight you at the front line kind of thing?
Well, speaking of the Danes, I think this is where the fear of kind of stacking Legos kind of comes into play, because if you'll remember, 25% tariffs on autos already exist. So a 30%, in theory, stacks on top of that. But the idea of carve-outs has already been in place. So one of the trade negotiations that are ongoing right now is the trade deal between the United States and Switzerland. So the idea of pharmaceuticals, which is the #1 export from Europe into the United States, maybe pharmaceutical sector tariffs could be carved out. You get exemptions from that. And that's really where the UK has this pat down, this idea that you can have defense carve-outs, auto carve-outs, agricultural carve-outs, so that even for the UK that has 10% right now, there are exceptions, there are asterisks, there's fine print. That's what the EU is trying to get to. But the problem is that you have to get 27 countries on board, where you have the likes of Emmanuel Macron ready to dive into battle, and others like the Danes saying, hold on, let's negotiate, let's talk this through. And that's ultimately the problem that Ursula von der Leyen has to deal with in Brussels.